One moment I was sure I was going to die, but what happened next completely changed my life. Let me share my near-death experience from 2020. My name is Emily Carter. Our car landed upside down, the roof crushed on the concrete guardrail, teetering on the edge of a cliff. In that moment, I was 100% sure we were going over. I accepted my fate and decided I was going to die. What struck me immediately was a profound sense of familiarity, almost like I had experienced this before. I want to share my near-death experience from 2020. I was 34 years old at the time, a passenger in a car driving on a high mountain road in the United States. The road was narrow, with a steep mountain on one side and a concrete guardrail separating us from a sheer drop on the other. As we were driving, another car swerved into our lane, forcing us off the road. We swerved onto the gravel shoulder and lost control. Everything happened incredibly fast. Our car spun out, collided with another vehicle, and then flipped upside down. We landed with the wheels up, the roof smashed into the guardrail, teetering over the cliff's edge. For me, what unfolded next was life-changing. In the split second after we lost control, I was convinced we were going over the cliff. Having worked as a paramedic in that region for years, I knew that when cars went over the cliff, survival was almost impossible. As soon as I felt the car spin, I closed my eyes, leaned back in my seat, relaxed my entire body, and accepted my fate. I decided I would die peacefully, almost like surrendering in a plane crash. But what happened next was far from what I expected. While the accident itself took only seconds, my experience felt like time had paused. I had an out-of-body experience. As I let go of control and accepted what was happening, I first lost my hearing, like someone had put earplugs in my ears. I kept my eyes closed, but a deep, dense darkness set in. I felt no heaviness, no tension, none of the physical sensations typical of being human. Instead, I felt a sense of lightness, as though I had left my body entirely. It was as if I was floating in a warm, soft, comforting, black space, like being in a cave of feathers. Once I arrived in this place, I was enveloped by an overwhelming sense of peace and safety. Everything felt perfect, as if all the things we long for in life, security, peace, and home, were present in that moment. I didn't see angels or religious figures, but I felt a strong sense of familiarity, as if I had been there before. It felt like I had passed through this space many times between lifetimes. Rather than calling it heaven, I prefer to think of it as a threshold to higher dimensions, a sort of waiting room where souls are welcomed and reunited. I didn't see specific beings, but I felt the presence of many around me. There was a knowing that I was surrounded by numerous entities, although I couldn't clearly see them in the dark space. Despite the darkness, I was not alone. As I took in the surroundings, even though only a few seconds had passed in real time, I felt telepathic waves of welcome from these beings. There was so much joy and excitement in reconnecting with me, a profound sense of familiarity that felt as though I had known them for far longer than this lifetime. These beings knew me intimately, not just as Chloe, the person I was in this lifetime, but as a soul that had existed through countless lives. There was an acceptance and deep knowing that went far beyond any relationship I had ever experienced. It was as though they could see straight into my soul, not just the version of me in this lifetime, but all the characters I had ever been. There was a shared understanding and happiness in coming together, free from the filters of physical appearance or human quirks. To be seen at a soul level by so many beings who had loved me across lifetimes was overwhelming. I felt chills just thinking about it. The connection was so deep that words weren't needed. There were no verbal exchanges, but I felt an unmistakable telepathic message. "We are so glad to see you again. This is such a special moment." It felt like a reunion, a coming together that transcended time and space. In that place, I didn't feel inferior or less important than the beings around me. There was no hierarchy. My physical self, my body, my personality, my story as Chloe, was still in the car, but my higher self was present with them. The best parts of me were joined with the best parts of these beings. It wasn't a hierarchy of souls, but rather a shared recognition of who we truly were. The experience gave me a deep sense of knowing who I am beyond this lifetime and the understanding that life on Earth is just one chapter in a much larger story. What became clear in that moment was that all the so-called mistakes, quirks, and imperfections that weigh us down in life didn't matter in this space. The beings around me didn't care about those things, and I no longer cared either. The worries of earthly life felt trivial. What mattered were the essences of God, the qualities of divinity within each of us. Although each soul was unique, our stories were deeply intertwined, woven together through many lifetimes. I could sense the appreciation for all the relationships and experiences we had shared across different lives. Time passed in that space as I continued to take in the overwhelming sense of welcome and acceptance. A special part of the experience was the knowledge of who I truly was, beyond my earthly identity. I realized that I was much more than just the person who lived on Earth, more than my job, my accomplishments, or my failures. There was so much more to me that carried on from life to life, and that essence was eternal. As these beings accepted me and welcomed me, I was reminded to accept myself in the same way. The feeling of being known and loved on such a profound level, coupled with the understanding that our earthly lives are only part of the story, was incredibly freeing. I realized there is so much more to us than what we see and experience in our day-to-day lives. Then, suddenly, I was back in the car, upside down, staring at the trees far below the cliff. My hearing returned, and I could hear the crunch of metal and the distant shouts of people, but despite the chaos, I was still filled with peace. I had just been home, and none of the physical dangers seemed to matter anymore. I knew that my existence wasn't tied to my body, and whether I was in or out of it didn't change who I was at my core. My partner, who had been driving, didn't have the same experience and was understandably shaken. As the years passed, I reflected on that near-death experience, realizing that it had unlocked a deeper understanding of myself and my spiritual journey. Looking back, that moment forever changed me, showing me that the essence of who we are transcends this world and connects us to something far greater. The realization that there is so much more to life, beyond just what we see and experience on Earth, was a pivotal moment for me. It became clear that what carries with us from life to life is the essence of the soul, and these things are eternal. The deep acceptance and love I felt from the beings who welcomed me reminded me that I, too, could feel that same acceptance for myself and others. This experience of oneness, where we are all connected yet still retain our individuality through the different lives we've lived, was incredibly freeing. It was a liberation to know that there is far more to who we are than just the roles we play on Earth. Then suddenly, I woke up in the car, upside down, staring at the trees below, a 700-foot drop straight down. As my senses returned, I could hear the metal crunching and people yelling. Yet despite being in the middle of what was one of the most dangerous moments of my life, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. It didn't matter, because I had just come from my true home, welcomed by beings who knew me beyond my earthly self. I realized then that I existed both in and out of my body, and that whether I was inside or outside of it didn't change the essence of who I was. While my partner, who was driving, didn't have the same out-of-body experience, the following years allowed me to reflect and reconnect with my past. After the accident, memories of my childhood began to surface, memories I had long blocked out. If you had asked me before the accident, I would have said I had no connection to the spiritual world, but slowly, I began to remember more and more about who I really was. One of the earliest memories that resurfaced was from when I was about 3 or 4 years old. I would wake up in the middle of the night, terrified from nightmares, and sometimes I would still see the beings from my dreams in my room. These experiences often caused me to wet the bed, too scared to go to the bathroom. The fear of the unknown and being alone in what felt like a spiritual dimension was too much for me as a child. Even though these specific memories were blocked, the deep-seated fear remained within me for years. As a child and teenager, up until about the age of 8, I struggled with paranoia, terror, and anxiety, unable to explain what I was going through to the adults around me. I suffered in silence. However, at 14, I had a very spiritual experience that I didn't block out, but had mostly forgotten about until after my near-death experience. I was at a church service, and they were playing music for a long time. Suddenly, I felt overwhelmed with an intense feeling in my body. While it wasn't an out-of-body experience, I sensed non-human beings around me, emanating pure love. I couldn't see them or describe them, but their presence was undeniable. I was overcome with emotion, started crying, and eventually left the service to find a quiet room where I sat for hours, feeling the presence and love of these beings. This was one of the first times I truly felt a connection to something beyond this world. If you had asked me back then, I would have said that I believed in God. But the near-death experience took me beyond the boundaries of any particular religion or belief system. It wasn't about following specific rituals or saying the right prayers to access a certain dimension. The experience was about aligning with the soul's true essence. It became clear that at the end of the day, we go where we are spiritually aligned, much like we gravitate toward people and places in regular life. I realized that death was not something to fear, and I suddenly felt a deep sense of trust and comfort around the concept of death. In the year following the accident, many things changed for me. I realized that few people could truly understand what I had gone through, so I became more selective about who I shared my story with. I started volunteering at a hospice because I wanted to connect with people who were nearing death, people who often straddle the line between this world and the next. Being around them, hearing their stories and experiences, reinforced my own belief in the existence of the other side. Many of them described experiences similar to mine, which further validated what I had seen and felt. My preferences and priorities shifted quickly. I no longer cared about accumulating material things, competing with others, or comparing myself to them. All of these things, which I hadn't even realized had weighed on me, suddenly became unimportant. I also ended my 13-year relationship with my partner because we were no longer on the same path. After selling the house and most of my belongings, I spent the next 2 years living in an RV, reconnecting with nature, and focusing on my spiritual growth through meditation, prayer, and long walks in the woods. Even though the near-death experience itself was brief, it left a lasting impact on my life. 5 years have passed, and I still live minimally, traveling often and carrying only what I need. I now run an online trauma coaching business and continue to do volunteer work. I hold on to the lessons I learned during that experience, especially the importance of surrendering to what is out of my control, letting go of attachment to outcomes, and staying grateful for the things I have. This experience changed everything for me, and I never really returned to the way I was before. I live each day with a deeper understanding of what truly matters, and a profound sense of peace in knowing that there is much more to this life than meets the eye.